What's up, Buckeye fans? It's Patrick Murphy here with another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. Excited to talk with you today coming out of 4th of July weekend. We are getting close to Big Ten Media Days out in Las Vegas in just a couple weeks, and then fall camp begins, and we are off and running with the 2025 Ohio State season. If you are joining us on the YouTube channel, please make sure you give that a thumbs up, turn on alerts, make sure you can get all of our videos. We will have plenty coming your way once we get out to Vegas for Big Ten Media Days and we start interviews during fall camp. If you're listening to this on your podcast platform of choice, please leave a 5-star review, leave us comments. All of that is very helpful. So the topic of today's show, before we get into it, going back to Red Stripe for the happy hour, took a few weeks off the Red Stripe, but we're going to go hooray beer today. Thought about going, cheers. I thought about going with, had some Busch Light in the refrigerator, but I decided to keep it a little classier today. With today's topic, I think it's something that's really interesting to me is how a team repeats, how you approach that, how you handle being the defending champion. There's a lot that goes into it. We've talked about it already some on this show, and we've covered it on Bucknuts, but I wanted to dive into it a little bit more. And to do so, I'm going to bring on Jordan Hill of Dawgs247, our 24/7 Sports Georgia site, who just a couple years ago covered Georgia on their repeat run to a national championship. Jordan, thanks for joining. How you doing, man?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick, and doing good. Like we were talking before we started recording, the season's just right around the corner, so it's a fun time of year, but happy to pop on and talk a little football.
Yeah, it's crazy just how quickly things go, from even the end of the football season, and then you get into basketball, get through spring practice, and it's like, all right, I can breathe a little bit, but it never stops. It's always coming. Not that I'm complaining. I think we both love what we do, so it could be much worse. Jordan, I know you've been on before, but just for the people that are maybe missed that when we were in the run-up to that 2022 game, why don't you give a little bit of your background, how long you've been covering the Bulldogs?
Yeah, so I actually went to Georgia, graduated 2016, was away for a few years, covered high school sports, covered Auburn University for a couple of years, and then came back. And I think the timing is kind of interesting for this conversation because I came back before the 2022 season. So Georgia had just won its first national championship since 1980. So obviously fans are excited about that, but I kind of got in between what wound up being back-to-back national championships. So it was a very interesting time to jump back on the beat, see how Kirby Smart and the players navigated such high expectations after a national title, and then obviously to see them wind up being successful and make it back-to-back.
Before we get too into it, I know that Ohio State fans out there will think back to that 2022 game where Georgia and Ohio State played down to the wire. Obviously, there is some debate from the Ohio State side. Let's try and put that aside if you're in the comments and whatnot. If you're watching live, we all were there. We all know what happened. Georgia ended up winning the game. Let's not make that part of this argument. They won the national championship because I think that it is relevant for this. So first, let's get into it. When that offseason kind of got underway, as you're coming back and you're starting to cover the team, what did you get the sense was the approach? Because Kirby Smart, that was obviously his first national championship. So he's going through this for the first time, similar to what Ryan Day will do this fall and has been doing this off season. How do you feel like the mood was around that program, repeating? How was that all handled within the Bulldogs?
I think Kirby Smart made it very clear, even as early as spring practice, that the group that was coming back for the 2022 season. I mean, he made this point multiple times. This is not the team that won the championship in 21. Now, there were some important pieces back from that team, but some big time players like a Jordan Davis, several other guys who wound up going pro. They were not back for the 2022 team. And Kirby really emphasized during that preseason that, none of these guys had won anything. A lot of guys were having to step up into bigger roles. And I honestly think that was, advantageous for Georgia. They had guys who were either going to be playing more than they did the year before or taking on roles for the first time. in 2022. So they had guys that were hungry. And you also had guys coming back who had played important roles and who had proven themselves. I mean, Stetson Bennett's a great example. Having A.D. Mitchell back, having some of the defenders like Nolan Smith back, Chris Smith, one of the safeties. Those guys were crucial, and having them and having proven pieces were big. But I really think more than anything, you had guys that were not necessarily riding the high of that championship. You had a lot of guys that were hungry and wanting to join, like the Nolan Smith or the Keely Ringo, who in that championship game against Alabama seals it. Those guys were part of that and very important parts of it. And I think you had a good mix of guys who had been there, done that. And you also had guys who were still unproven as far as being championship caliber players. And I think those guys were hungry to go do so, go prove that they were up to that challenge.
I think that hunger part is really important. Like if you look at professional sports, the roster from one championship year to the repeat attempt, at least, probably doesn't turn over all that much. But in college, it can turn over quite a bit, right? And I think Ohio State is kind of similar to Georgia with the number of people that they lost to the NFL. The mentality of those guys, though, you can say it, right? Oh, we didn't really contribute. That wasn't really our national championship. How do you think the Georgia players actually lived that? Obviously, they followed through. They got that second national title. But how do you actually, in your mind, make that a reality when a lot of those guys at least were on the roster, even if they weren't contributors?
I think it was really just the day-to-day approach, and something that I'm interested in for 2025. Kirby has really made a habit of sort of having a team motto every year. And if I'm remembering right, in 22, the motto was "Nobody cares," and it was just like, look, what you've done in the past, nobody cares about that. You have to go out there and prove it. And I think that was not just sort of a talking point for Kirby. It came across with some of the team leaders. I think about center Cedric Van Pran, who came back on that 2022 team. Those guys were motivated and understood that nothing was going to be given to them. And also, they had a target on their back. I mean, that was the first time, again, Georgia had won a national title in 4 decades. That was as big of a target as Georgia had ever had going into a season. So I think those guys understood that no one was going to go through the motions. I'm sure that Kirby Smart and his staff didn't take things any easier. And I think about, too, with Cedric Van Pran, who I mentioned, when we talked to him in spring practice, there was a point during the spring where they went out to Sanford Stadium, and I think it was, like a scrimmage or something like that. And there was a logo from that first national championship. And Cedric was mad. Like, Cedric was like, why is that out there? We've already turned the page. And to me, that's a great example of, I think about, from my perspective, I think it would be very easy to get content and say, look, we won this national championship. Let's enjoy it. A lot of those guys like Cedric Van Pran were driven to, hey, that was nice, but what would be nicer is to go do it again. And I think that showed up in their approach every single day. And I do think that's a big reason why they not only came back and won the national title, they wound up going undefeated, which is something they did not do in 2021.
That's interesting you say that, because a lot of the Ohio State players have asked for things to be taken down around the facility. There's obviously still some stuff up, but like in the meeting rooms and things like that, they were similar kind of sentiment of like, we didn't win this, we don't need to see this every day, type of thing. So interesting that it's already there's already some parallels here. Obviously, we'll see how it all plays out. Once these guys got on the field, you're talking winter workouts, spring practice, even summer stuff. What did you kind of sense? You've already talked about the mentality, but did you get a feel that, okay, this might be an opportunity for these guys to actually go out and do it and not just talk the talk?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at what they had coming back and when you look at just how they had recruited up to that point, you felt like there was a pretty good chance Georgia would have the potential to go back to back. And, to fast forward a little bit, once they opened the season against Oregon, I think that was like a 49-3 win. That was really when you knew, okay, this team has the potential to go do this again. But I mean, I think the thing too that gave you a good sense that nobody was satisfied, no one was going through the motions. There were guys who wound up losing starting jobs, at the start of that season. And I think that showed you that the coaches were not content just letting guys roll out. I mean, William Poole was a starting star the nickelback for Georgia for the majority of that 21 season. He loses his job to Javon Bullard, who I'm sure Ohio State fans remember well from that Peach Bowl. But he wins that job, takes it from a guy who had been a starter. And then you get into the season, and Malachi Starks winds up winning a job over Dan Jackson. And Malachi was 5-star freshman, big time. People had high hopes for him. But again, I think that kind of spoke to that nobody had earned anything. Nobody was getting a job in 22 because they had that job in 21. I think guys were pushed and guys were asked to do more, no matter what they did in 21. And I think that only helped the team because they really got the best, 11 on both sides, best 22 out there, and it wound up really paying off over the course of the season.
Kirby was on the Alabama staff when they went back to back, right? Does that sound right?
Okay. Yes.
How much do you think he leaned on what he saw from that coaching staff, from Nick Saban, just the way that they approach things? Did he talk about that at all?
Yeah, I think that was important, and I think that was good experience. And I think that sort of goes back to the conversation, the start of our conversation, that I don't think Kirby ever really looked at it as a team going back to back. He looked at it as two different teams. And I think that was a point he made over the course of that season, was like, look, yeah, there's some guys back from last year, but a whole lot of guys are being asked to play bigger roles or have starting roles for the first time. So to me, that feels very, very Nick Saban-esque, was that, look, yeah, we might have won it last year, but that doesn't mean anything now. And I really do think that Kirby was being sincere. They knew they had guys back, and there were guys that had been proven and guys they could count on, but they understood that, the situation was very different, having lost guys to the NFL, that wouldn't guarantee them anything in 22, just because there were a lot of different elements to that team.
You talked about some of the names. Obviously, you need the talent to win, right? What was the collection of talent like? Obviously, Ohio State fans saw it at the end, but as you kind of went into that season, and we'll get to the season in a second, but just in comparison to maybe the year before, and I know you weren't covering it, but I assume being a Georgia alum, you were following pretty closely. What was the talent like between first national championship, second national championship?
I think the defense in 21 was a little bit better, having some of those guys like Jordan Davis. But at the same time, I mean, the drop off on the defense from 21 to 22 was very minimal. And a big part of that, losing Jordan Davis, but you had Jalen Carter. And Jalen Carter was a guy who I can remember, going back to that 21 run, that there were stories, I think, like Bruce Feldman in The Athletic. I remember him doing a story on Jalen Carter, basically like, look, everybody's talking about Jordan Davis, and Jordan Davis is good, but people are telling me, watch Jalen Carter. And Jalen played really well on the way to that national title. Looking at, really, to me, the offense in 22 was the biggest difference, and a lot of it was tied to Stetson Bennett. And I think that Stetson was a very important element, and kind of a rare element going into 2022, because for a lot of Georgia fans, they felt like Georgia won in spite of Stetson in 21, and I don't think that was fair. But I think that Stetson kind of took that to heart. And, after they won the title in 21, I think a lot of people just assumed, look, Stetson's going to ride off into the sunset. That was nice. A very incredible story, a walk-on, sticks around and winds up winning a championship. Yeah. And, what we heard over the course of that 2022 season was Stetson was basically going to the coaches being like, why should I leave? What's the point? Why not try to do this again? And Stetson came back and played significantly better than he did in 21, which I think a part of that was because Stetson was seen as the very clear starting quarterback that entire offseason. So, yeah, I mean, the comparing the two teams, I think the offense took a step forward in 22, and a lot of that had to do with Stetson. And again, I think that 21 defense was just so nasty with guys like Jordan Davis, Nakobe Dean. There was drop off in 22, but it wasn't significant, and that defense had a lot to do with the fact that they won every game they played, and the defense for the most part played really, really well.
And talking about Stetson sort of takes me right to where I was going to ask you next. The leadership. You mentioned the guys that left, but how important were the guys who stepped into leadership roles, or maybe a guy like him who was already in a leadership role, to keeping that right mentality as you head into the season and even during the season?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a situation where you had the right sort of formula of guys who had done it versus guys who were stepping up and being asked to do more. So having Stetson, having Jalen Carter, having Nolan Smith, having Keely Ringo, they had a good collection of talent. A.D. Mitchell as well, and then Brock Bowers, obviously, got to mention him. Cedric Van Pran, the center who I talked about earlier. I just think that they had a group that came back, sort of like I mentioned with Stetson, with the mentality of, look, we want to come back, and this is not, just like a celebration of what we did last year. We want to come back and do even more. And, I think those guys bought into what it would take to get there because they had just seen it the year before. And I think without that collection of leadership, that they don't repeat, that they don't have the success they had. They had guys who understood and were respected. I think that was a group of guys that if they saw something among their teammates they didn't like in practice, they would let them know. But again, that comes with having won a national championship. Those guys saw what it took. And I think for the most part, those guys understood the standard they all had to play to. And for the most part, they did that throughout the year.
You mentioned going undefeated as opposed to the 2021 season. Were there moments in the season where you questioned this team at all, or, close games, things that, could have gone wrong type of situation? Or did it feel throughout the year like this team was just on a roll?
There were definitely some moments. I'm looking back over the schedule as we talk, and the biggest one was at Missouri. And it was one of those, especially once you got into like November, December, that I think that game, they win 26-22. And I mean, they won by the slimmest of margins. It's a game that they had to come back. They kept forcing Missouri field goals. And one of the biggest plays of the game, Missouri broke off, I think it was a long catch, and Malachi Starks chases a guy down, tackles him at the 1, and they wind up forcing a field goal rather than giving up a touchdown. But I think that game and the comeback that Georgia had to win that game kind of woke everybody up and sort of let them know, look, we have to really get stuff in gear. We really have to play better to be able to make it through this regular season and have a chance to go win another one. So that game, they had a game at Kentucky late in the year, cold. I think Stetson Bennett kind of gets banged up. They win 16-6. And it was just sort of, just kind of trying to survive. For whatever reason, Kentucky always seems to be that for Georgia. It was that last year, a very ugly game in Lexington. So those two games really were the ones that were really tight. And other than that, they pretty much controlled things in the regular season. And then, I mean, the game that's already been mentioned a few times, the Peach Bowl, for all intents and purposes, was the national championship. It was certainly more entertaining. And I think whoever won that game was going to win the national title. And for them to come back like they did in the fashion, it's still, they had to get every break to make that comeback against Ohio State, and then still needed that kick at the end to go wide left. That was really as close as they came to being, to having to watch the national championship from home.
When going into the playoff there, obviously different playoff format now, but what was the mentality of that team? You're playing an Ohio State team that didn't win the Big Ten, but obviously a talented team. Just what do you remember about kind of the lead up to that game, and then maybe even the TCU game? Because at that point you're so close to repeating, right? But you got to still win those two games. What stands out to you about that period of time as they headed into the playoff?
I think they recognized, I remember the talk leading up to that Peach Bowl that, even with the assumption, which wound up being wrong, that Michigan would win that Fiesta Bowl and move on to the national title, a lot of people felt like, okay, Georgia, Ohio State, this is as good as the national championship could be because of how good Ohio State was and the caliber of that team. So I think that it benefited Georgia. I don't think there was any sense of anybody getting caught looking ahead, because they knew what Ohio State was. And if they didn't know that, they learned by probably 2 quarters of that game in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. So, no, I think that game had their full attention. I think even, Georgia had played a few weeks before that in the SEC title game in that stadium. And it was a game Georgia wins 50-30. It wasn't really that close, but that secondary starts giving up plays in the second half, and LSU, I think, pushed them a little bit more than they would have liked. So I think that they came in understanding what they were going to be up against with Ohio State. Now that didn't stop, Marvin Harrison Jr. from going off and from making a ton of plays. But I think that it really benefited Georgia that they understood the caliber of opponent and that they knew that if they got caught sleeping, they were going to leave Atlanta with a loss.
I know you didn't cover the 2021 national championship, but talking to people, maybe people you know on the beat that did cover it, what was it like? Just maybe some differences, the celebrations, things like that. You win it twice, and obviously there were some guys who, as you said, stepped into bigger roles. But just how did they handle that, I guess, as opposed to winning it for the first time? And as you said, like 40 years.
I think it was really the details around both of those games that even for fans, I think that the 22 championship just absolutely pales in comparison to 21 for a number of reasons. The fact it was the first since 1980, the fact it was Alabama. If we were sitting here in 2025 and Georgia had won 2 national championships, but neither national championship involved Alabama, I think for a lot of people, there would kind of be that asterisk of like, yeah, they won them, but they couldn't beat Alabama, which made 21 so special for a lot of people around Georgia. And 22, I mean, that it just was a total blowout. I think 65-7 wound up being that final against TCU. And
Yeah.
I give credit to a lot of people. I think I had Georgia by like 10 or 14. I mean, I thought it would be a competitive game, but when we had media day, that was either the day or 2 days before, and Georgia came in first, and then TCU came in, and there were people talking to me being like, TCU guys weren't quite as big as those Georgia guys as they came through, so maybe that should have been the sign that some pain was on its way. But no, I think that they got to that national championship with the full intention of ending it the way they wanted to, and I mean it really was a quarter of the way in of that game against TCU. You already knew, I think I had probably 80% of what I was going to write that day, Patrick, written. And I honestly did hate that just for the fact of what that game should be like and what that game should mean. And Georgia just completely took control and ended it the way that they wanted to and left no question about it.
Did you feel like the celebration was, I know you weren't there for it the year before, covering it at least, but did you feel like the celebration was kind of the same level among fans, among players, among everybody?
I don't think so. And I think a big part of that was because 21 was against Alabama and it was their first national championship. But I do think there was a different element in 22 because that was sort of the send-off of some big guys. I mean, Stetson Bennett being number one. I mean, the fact that ended his career, but there were several other guys, who wind up moving on and getting ready for the NFL. So I think, the people who were on that team enjoyed 22 and understood what it took to get there. And I do think the element of going undefeated mattered, but just every part of the 21 story, the fact that they came through, the fact that Alabama had beaten them in the SEC title game to start December, and then Georgia comes back, I think that made it a lot more special for fans. But I'm sure that Kirby Smart and those players after that national championship against TCU, they enjoyed it, that they took it all in, and they understood that, the thing that I think sometimes we forget about, Georgia was the first team in the playoff era to go back to back. I think stuff like that matters to them, and they understood that, that was rare air that they were in, and they made sure to enjoy every minute of it.
Well, I've got you, and this will be the last thing. As you just look ahead to this season, tell the people kind of what to expect out of Georgia this year. Just a little preview of 2025 Bulldogs.
Wouldn't be surprised at all if we're talking about the Buckeyes and the Bulldogs in the postseason this year. I think that Georgia's got a really good chance to make it back to the college football playoff, and they've made it easy for me this year, Patrick. I mean, the big question is the quarterback. That's who everybody wants to know about with Gunnar Stockton. I think that he's a quarterback very capable of leading Georgia where they want to go, which is to contend for another national title and to be in that playoff mix. And Georgia, I think, deserves a lot of credit that they've brought and done a very good job of surrounding him with talent. Zachariah Branch from USC, Noah Thomas from Texas A&M, have some proven guys back along with him. And then you look at the defense, KJ Bolden had a great freshman year. You got guys like CJ Allen, Raylan Wilson, The big force up front. They need Christian Miller to have a big season, but we're getting ready for SEC Media Days next week. There will be a lot of conversation. To me, it's going to be a race between Georgia, Alabama, and Texas, which is really no different than last year. But
Yeah.
I think Georgia is a playoff caliber team, and we'll just have to see how they navigate a pretty difficult schedule in 2025.
Well, Jordan, thank you. As we talked about off the top, this is the start of everything ramping back up. So I appreciate you taking time to jump on, and I think that was informative as we look ahead to the Buckeyes trying to repeat, and hopefully, like you said, we'll see each other down the road here.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Talk to you soon, Jordan. Appreciate it again. Thanks again for Jordan for jumping on here. We've been talking about this for a few weeks now, trying to get timing lined up and stuff to have this conversation. So I appreciate him taking some time out of his day and busy schedule to jump on with us. If you do want to read anything about the Bulldogs, go over to Dawgs247. Those guys do a great job. I know in talking to Buckeye fans in our network during the lead up to the 2022 game, and even after, they were people that really enjoyed kind of going back and forth and reading some of the coverage from the other side of things over at their site. So if you're interested in what's going on with Georgia, and as Jordan mentioned, the SEC Media Days are coming up next week. There will be a lot going on over there. So check those guys out. I want to kind of look at some of what Jordan said and how we can apply it to Ohio State this year and what the Buckeyes have to do what the Bulldogs did back in 2022 and repeat. Obviously, everything won't be the same. They're two very different teams, but I do think there's some commonalities there. And I think there's some other things that I think apply a little bit more to Ohio State. There are some obvious things as well. First thing being, you got to figure out the quarterback situation, right? And how that plays out will obviously dictate the rest of the season. You got to have that quarterback play. You've seen it in the past. It doesn't guarantee you anything. CJ Stroud was obviously on that 2022 team that went to the playoff, and as well as he played, the Buckeyes just couldn't quite get over the hump. So you've got to figure out that, and then you've got to fill holes, obviously, from the guys that left. But one thing that Jordan mentioned, two things that Jordan mentioned that I think really do apply to this Ohio State team is the hungry younger guys who are stepping into bigger roles. That for me, assuming those guys can fill those roles, it's going to be important to have guys who maybe learned from those guys the year before. Let's use an example of Arvell Reese. I think that's a good one. He played some last year. He wasn't a starter. He got to watch Cody Simon, right? And now he's going to step into Cody Simon's shoes. Guy like that, got to be hungry to prove, okay, yeah, I technically have a championship ring, but I didn't play a ton in the 2024 season. Now I want to go and show I can do it, right? And you kind of have those guys all over this roster. And Arvell, for instance, played. Oh, I have the wrong thing here. I'll pull it up. The Arvell played. I believe he played in every game. Yeah, here we go. He played 307 snaps. He was the third most behind the starting linebackers, Cody Simon, Sonny Styles. But Cody Simon played 797 snaps. So that's more than double what Arvell played. So he was a contributor. He wasn't a huge contributor. So if I'm Arvell Reese, if I'm Kenyatta Jackson, if I'm Brandon Innes, those guys that we obviously know are talented. We've seen the ability there, but now it's their turn. It's the opportunity to step into the role that they watched and sort of filled in for. That hunger, I think, is really important. And I think if you look at any championship team, be it college, pro, whatever, like it's hard to, especially if you have a lot of the same guys back, to climb that mountain again. You've got to do all of those things that you did to get there the first time. You got to go through off-season conditioning. You got to go through spring practice. You got to go through hot summer workouts, like all of that stuff. And it's easier mentally when you haven't done it. You haven't won a championship, right? and, you can push yourself. You know that that's out there. But when you have, okay, do you cut corners? Do you, we're already the best, so on and so forth. When you have guys like those that I mentioned who have seen how you do it, and I think that's important too. These aren't new guys coming in. These are guys that watched it happen last year, know what it takes to reach that level, the work that has to be put in, but they have the motivation to do that. And I don't want to insult the guys that are back and were key parts at all, because I think they are hard workers too. But there's just that mental, those guys will push it a little bit further. And even some of the freshmen, they now, and they probably won't be key contributors, but they now have an opportunity to be a part of a national championship team and push those guys. So as Jordan was talking about with Georgia, having those guys who hadn't won it before, he mentioned a logo on the field that they were like, why is that there? We've seen similar things with Ohio State over at the Woody, like I said, where guys just, we don't need all of these banners. Yeah, if you go inside the indoor athletic facility at the Woody, there is the national championship. There's the pictures of each of the bowl games, all that. But most of the offices and the team meeting room and stuff like that, they didn't want that stuff up because they didn't win it. And I think that's a really positive thing. It was interesting to hear that Georgia had a similar situation. The next thing that I think connects is those guys that are coming back, the guys that have to be leaders on this repeat attempt. And for Ohio State, you look at Caleb Downs, you look at Sonny Styles, you look at Davison Igbinosun. Obviously, those three guys are all on the defensive side of things. Offensively, Carson Hinsman, even Austin Saraveld, really four of the five offensive linemen. Luke Montgomery didn't play as much as those guys, but he was a key part of the playoff run. A Will Kazmarek, I know he didn't have a huge role, but he played a good amount once he was healthy. The receivers, Carnell Tate, obviously Jeremiah Smith, like those guys that were important parts of last year's team, they have to be the leaders, while they may need the guys that didn't play as much to push and get them through some of those things. The leaders have to be there. I think if you're starting over with an entirely different team, it makes it that much difficult. You need, as Jordan talked about, a nice blend of that leadership and the young guys or inexperienced guys, maybe not inexperienced, that's not the right term, but those guys that haven't done it at the level that they'd like now to push a nice mix of that. There also has to be the talent factor. We talked about that with Jordan. Obviously, Georgia had that. I think Ohio State has that. And I think a lot of you would say so as well. And while we're on the topic, if you're watching this live, does Ohio State repeat? What do you think? Let me know in the chat. Do you think the Buckeyes go back-to-back? And I asked this on Twitter and on our message board and got some very interesting responses. If you had to pick one for this season being 2025, not other seasons, this season, would it be a win against Michigan, ending that 4-game losing streak, or would it be a repeat national championship? Let me know in the chat here. I'll throw some of your answers up as I see them come in. But the talent for Ohio State, I think that you look across the board, you look at the recruiting rankings, all that stuff, the talent is there. I don't discount that at all. I think we've talked about some of the areas where Ohio State has some issues, the depth of defensive tackle. I mentioned needing to get the quarterback situation figured out earlier. You still have to figure out the safety spot. I actually wrote an article this past week, if you want to read it, on Bucknuts, about the position battles going into fall camp. We've got some intel in there if you're a VIP member, so join that. But I think that the talent is there. They do have something to figure out, obviously, and I think every team does, but the talent is there to make a run. And we got some comments coming in here. Kevin Chavez says, repeat national championships. Natties are the ultimate goal. Doug Shepard agrees. Repeat by far. Browns 330, repeat. Buck Rational says, I'll take another natty. So it's interesting. The poll that I did was pretty split down the middle of ending that against Michigan or winning a national championship. Buck Rationals here, but I think it's highly unlikely to get another natty without being good enough to blast that team up north. Yeah, I mean, look, we thought that last year, didn't we? We thought that, Ohio State, especially at home, would go out there and handle business. Obviously, your ideal scenario is what Georgia did in 2022, right? You run the table. And I think that kind of takes me into the next point is the schedule for Ohio State. You look at that Georgia schedule in 2022. They played Oregon week 1, number 11 Oregon week 1, ran them out of the building. Ohio State, obviously, week 1, you know what's coming. It's Ohio State, Texas. And so you have that opportunity, similar to what Georgia did as the defending national champions, to make a statement week 1 against another really good team. Georgia went on to play Samford, South Carolina, Kent State, Missouri. Jordan talked about that Missouri game, Auburn, Vanderbilt, Florida. And then it was against Tennessee, another top highly ranked team. For me, that was for Georgia. That was in, when was that game? November 5th. Well, if you're Ohio State, you obviously have that week 1 game against Texas. But the next game that I think everyone's eyes will be on is against Penn State, November 1st. So very similar there. Now, I will say within there, if you're Ohio State, you have to go out to Washington. We'll see what Washington is. At Illinois, which I think is probably the sneaky game for this team this year. I think Illinois is going to be pretty good. At Wisconsin always makes for a difficult environment. We'll see how good the Badgers are. So there are some games in there, and Georgia had some similar, we mentioned that Missouri game. Jordan mentioned the Kentucky game. But then really you go Purdue, UCLA, Rutgers, you're at Purdue, and then it's at Michigan, right? The rivalry game there. And Georgia ended their season against LSU. So kind of a really similar, and I hadn't even thought about this before looking at it, but a really similar schedule for both teams. Now, can Ohio State run that table? I think there's an opportunity, especially if you win week 1 against Texas, because I think that sets a tone. Now, if you lose that game, you have plenty of time to respond. I was on 97.1 The Fan here locally in Columbus on Thursday night, and we were talking about that there is an opportunity. Like, if there's a game to lose, it's probably that one. Now, 1-2 losses, you're probably still in the playoff, right, with the 12-team playoff. But I think if you can win that Texas game, that sets the tone, right? And the confidence is high. The guys stepping in that we talked about are right there, and you've seen it happen. I don't know what happened with my my camera there. If you can't see me, let me know. But let me know if the picture's still working here. For me, it showed I wasn't there, but I'll keep talking nonetheless. Apologize if it did go out. Not sure what I did there, but the opportunity to beat Texas week 1 and really set a tone, because then you go Grambling, Ohio, and you can run those games, I think, pretty easily. Out to Washington, that's a trip, but it's not that difficult. Okay. Kevin says, can't see you, but can hear you. Yeah, apologize for that. I'm not sure why the picture went out, but I'll finish what I was saying. I don't have too much more anyway. Anyway, I think that Texas game can set a tone, as I was saying, and it inspires confidence if you win that game, especially with a young quarterback, be it Julian Sand or Lincoln Keenholz. If you can play well in that game, get the W, young, guys stepping into new roles, everybody feels better. So I think the schedule plays out pretty nicely to get on a roll there. You've got midseason in October. You have to go those back-to-back weeks on the road, Illinois, Wisconsin, and then the Penn State game we talked about, obviously ending the year at Michigan. So I think the schedule plays out pretty well. And then finally, I think the coaching staff, which is not something we talked a ton about with Jordan. He did mention Kirby Smart and kind of his experience. I think what you do have with this staff is you have Ryan Day, who I think is still very motivated. He talked early in the offseason about wanting to be a guy who just not just won one national championship, but won multiple national championships. If he can do that, obviously he goes down in legendary history, because not many coaches at Ohio State have won back-to-back or even multiple national championships. Actually, no one's won back-to-back. Mike Schaefer there. You've never looked better, Patrick. Yeah, I'm sure the blank screen is the best I've looked. No doubt about that. But I think if you look at the rest of the coaching staff, like it's similar to the roster. You've got some guys that have a lot to prove, like Brian Hartline stepping in as the new offensive coordinator. He hasn't done that before. This is his chance to show what he can do in that role. Then you have some more experienced guys like a Larry Johnson, Tim Walton, guys like that who've been around a little bit. And then I think maybe the biggest thing of all is the addition of Matt Patricia and what he brings, having won multiple championships with the New England Patriots. Not even talking schematically what he'll be able to do, but just that experience and working with Bill Belichick and figuring out how you handle a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. I think that a guy like that, and he's motivated because the last 2 times he was on a coaching staff, when he was the head coach of the Detroit Lions, and then when he stepped in late in the season to sort of run the the defense for the Philadelphia Eagles, it didn't go well. So this is his chance, sort of like Chip Kelly last year, to sort of change the narrative, change his image, those type of things. And I think that is really important as well. So he's got experience. He's got motivation. I think you've got a really nice blend. And, Ryan Day at the top. I was a guy who continued to defend Ryan Day all of last season. We'll see, where he is at the end of his career. But even when everything was going sideways, the questions about can he win the big games, it was like, well, the big games he lost, take Michigan out of it. I think that's its own separate conversation. Like losing to Oregon at home, not great, but losing to Georgia, that was a 1-point game. People want to discount the Notre Dame wins for whatever reason. So I think you've seen Ryan Day make that shift to the elite level head coach that at least I thought, and I think a lot of people did, he could be. So I think you've got a really nice blend. A lot of things still have to go right. I mean, there's a reason that teams don't win back-to-backs, and I'm not just talking college football. I'm talking in all sports very often. It is not easy to do. But if you look at a blueprint, sort of like what Georgia is, I think Ohio State has a lot of the makings to be that team that does it again. And you have it a little bit easier than Georgia or other teams in the past have, because getting into the 12-team playoff is a little bit easier, right? So there is a little bit there. It's just me, Tim asked, how nervous are you about Hartline Day calling plays 1 to 10? If you're saying 1 is the lowest, I'm not very worried. I think Brian Hartline's been preparing for this for a long time. I think he knows that this is a big opportunity. I don't love having a first-time play caller as your offensive coordinator at a place like Ohio State, but you also had a first-time head coach. So there will be bumps in the road, but the good thing is he'll be working hand-in-hand with Ryan Day. He'll be working with Tyler Bowen. That's another guy who's got to be motivated, coming from West Virginia, or Virginia Tech, excuse me. Tyler Bowen, who was an offensive coordinator. So I do think that he has a lot of guys he can lean on. I think he's seen really good guys in Kevin Wilson and Ryan Day, obviously, and Chip Kelly. So will it be perfect? No, I think there may be some bumps, but I think that's true just in general. That there may be some bumps with Matt Patricia as well, and he's obviously a veteran doing that. So let's see. Mike Schaefer said Texas has no idea what Patricia's going to do. Maybe the difference. Yeah, I mean, that certainly, week 1, you've got a whole new defensive coordinator calling things. I do think, the big picture stuff will remain the same with the way that Ohio State plays defense in terms of, the 4-2-5 and things like that. But yeah, I mean, Matt Patricia, I wrote today something about how the safeties, the best situation may be to play both Malik Hartford and Jalen McClain instead of trying, unless one really steps up, like those guys can do some different things. And the good thing about Matt Patricia is he's done some of that before, recognizing guys' best attributes and putting them in position to be really successful. All right, let's see if we've got anything else here. I see some Paul Feinbaum comments. Yeah, I don't understand. I mean, I understand why Paul Feinbaum. If you missed it, it was more Arch Manning, Ohio or Texas will come in and beat Ohio State stuff. I'm sure you can find it out there. But the funny thing for me is, like, are you doing this? Were you this excited about Arch Manning a few years ago when he was a recruit going to Texas and Texas wasn't in the SEC? What have you seen that has made you this excited about Arch Manning? I mean, I just don't know with Arch Manning. I don't think you've seen enough from him as a quarterback in college to know, he did start 2 games last year, but they were against 2 really bad teams. So, I'm not saying that he won't go out and be as good as his uncles. I also don't know if he's going to be a superstar. Like, I don't know. His high school, where he played high school, it wasn't against the best competition. Like, I don't know. I think it's too early to start crowning somebody like that, but I'm always on the cautious side. But obviously, Paul Feinbaum has an agenda with where he works and everything. It's just me, Tim points out, Chip Kelly wasn't perfect, but knew how to get big plays. Not sure Hartline knows how to trick the opponent to get big plays. Yeah, but I don't know if you need to trick guys with how much talent is on this roster, right? Like, I think you can play more often than not, just play your game and you're going to be good. But I do think Hartline has studied this stuff. It wasn't like he was just only focused on coaching wide receivers the last couple of years. He knew this was coming. Obviously, he was named the OC 2 years ago. So he's been preparing for this, no doubt about it. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap up. I apologize that the camera went out. Again, I don't know what happened there. Yeah, I tried to fix it again. But I appreciate you guys all tuning in. This was another great group as we continue through the off season. As someone said earlier, only 7 weeks left until the college football season begins. Like I said, Big Ten Media Days are just a couple weeks away. So if you haven't already and you're watching this on YouTube, please turn on notifications, hit that bell, all that stuff. We will have plenty more videos, all of our podcasts, everything. You don't want to miss that. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, please leave a 5-star review, leave comments. If there's anything you think we need to do differently, let us know. We appreciate that. And you won't be able to see me drink some of this Red Stripe here, but I promise that we are doing it. Oh, and thanks again to Jordan for coming on from Dawgs247. Again, if you want to read about SEC Media Days, any of that stuff, the Bulldogs, go on over to Dawgs247. Those guys do a great job. Anyway, guys, apologize again for the picture here. We'll have that sorted next time. Cheers.